Right, so I'm going to start with the bottom part of my cupcake, so the packaging. So I'm going to draw a curved line of the cupcake case, and then I'm going to measure with my pencil. If you have printed off the image, you can do the same, just to get my proportions right. And then I'm going to do the same curve for the top of the case. For now, I'm very lightly just going to draw this rough shape in here, just while I work out the proportions. So you want to remember not to press too hard with your pencil. You want to be able to rub it out easily if you make a mistake. And then I'm going to just draw the sides in here. Just doing quite sketchy lines. And bringing that down. And neaten this up afterwards, so I'm not too bothered about how the bottom part of this looks with the multiple lines on top of each other. So now I've done that, I've roughly drawn in where this cupcake sits. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw the bottom part of the icing. I'm going to keep looking back at my image. And for now, we're not doing any shading, we're just drawing that outline. Bring that up and round. I'm looking at how the icing curves. So that is the bottom half of my cupcake and the first line of the icing. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to work that icing up to the top where the cherry is. You can see that it's almost this sort of shape. So it's not the same shape all the way up. So as I work in, I'm going to keep looking at where this shape goes. Keep looking back at my image. And I'm going to keep looking at the different curves and shapes in the icing. So I'm working layer at a time. If you need to pause this video at any time to catch up, you can. And I can see that the icing at the top dips to allow space for that cherry. So when you look at your image, you can see there is more icing to the edge of the cupcake on the right hand side than there is on the left. You can see on the left that the edge of the cupcake is in line with the icing. So just bringing that out a little bit, like so. I'm going to add this cherry on the top so you can see that the shape is curved. And I'm just going to draw roughly in where I'm going to shade the cherry there. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to draw very lightly some of the shading that you can see at the bottom, so that when I start shading, it's easier for me to know where to put the darker sections, like this. So now that we've done that, what we're going to do is I'm just going to drop this down a little bit. So that I've got a guide for where my zigzag lines go. So I'm now going to add these zigzag lines in, just very lightly, and curving them with the line. Moving it up around the edge of the cupcake. So I'm just going to lighten this line up a little bit. So I should just be left with the zigzags. So what we're trying to do is take a sketch to a finished drawing. So some of this zigzag will have shadow around it at the end. So now that we've done that, we're going to start adding in some of these lines. We're going to look at the direction the lines are going in. The lines at the front are going to just be straight lines down. As you get round the cupcake case, they're going to start to go a slightly more diagonal line to fit in with the shape that we've drawn here. So they're going to start to tilt, especially on the left-hand side. And then they're going to blend together on the edge. And then I'm just going to draw in roughly where that shading is going to be on the edge. I'm also going to draw a slight circle here, the edge of the circle, for where our shadow is going to go. So what we have now is the outline of our sketch. We're now going to start shading. So when we shade, we start with the darkest first to the lightest. So I'm going to start on this cherry first and work my way down so that I'm not smudging as I move my hand. So I can see that this side of the cherry is quite dark. So I'm just adding these darker sections in. I'm looking back at my image because you can see on your image that there are white spaces within the cherry. So you want to make sure you're keeping that white space so that we create a 3D image or a 3D effect. We also want to make sure we're following the line as much as possible. So this line here is curved, so I'm going to curve my shading in rather than going up and down with my shading. So I'm going to follow the contour lines. Just going to add some of that mid-tone in there. And then maybe darken up certain sections that I want to be a bit darker. So what I'm going to do is I'm now going to move on to the icing. If I think sections need to be darker, I will go back and make those darker at the end. So the icing is quite light, so we're going to keep that white space there. We're not going to touch that white space. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over some of these lines a bit darker and start to add some of these mid-tones in. Again, just curving my shading to suit the shape of the icing. So you can see that there's some darker parts, some shadows. And then there's some lighter parts on the icing as well. So for now I'm just going to add in these darker sections and some of the mid-tones as well. Some of that shading in there, and then there's this darker section on the left. So I'm going to make that shadow darker. I'm going to add these mid-tones in here. Press even lighter with my pencil for the middle of that icing. Like I said earlier, if you need to pause the video and catch up, you can. And I'm just looking back at my image after each line just to check that my drawing's remaining accurate. And thinking, where is the next place that I need to add the shading into? I'm also defining some of these shapes a bit more. Just to start adding that detail in there. If I don't think a line's dark enough, when I've finished, I'll go back and I'll change that. So this section here is quite dark. So I'm going to apply more pressure to my pencil. And I'm going to follow that line down and into this corner here. Going back over to this side of the cupcake now. This side of the cupcake is a lot lighter, so I'm putting less pressure on my pencil when I'm drawing. Adding this curve in and adding some of this shading I can see on the top section of that part of the icing. Adding the shading that goes under this section. Curving this round, adding that shading in there. Bringing this line down and around. Pressing slightly harder with my pencil, but not as light as these sections here, or as dark as these sections here. Move this line down. Create that darker section there. Remembering to keep some of this white here. Adding in these curved lines to match up with this section here. And then just adding this shading in. You can see there's a curve there. It's slightly darker. And then back to being lighter. That last shape in there. And then I'm going to bring the shading down on this side. And I'm just bringing it down onto the cupcake. Again, I'm following the lines and the shape to give that 3D effect. I'm just going to darken that up a bit. Bringing it under this shape here, and background, and then it disappears into that section of the icing. So now that we've done that, I'm going to really lightly add the shading onto the cupcake itself. I'm going to press darker and apply more pressure in certain sections, but again following the shape of the cupcake, so my shading is going in this direction. I'll go back at the end and make any sections darker that I feel need to be. But for now, I'm happy with how that cupcake looks, and I'm going to move on to the cupcake case. So a lot of this cupcake case is white. The only darker sections are going to be the shadows from where the cupcake case creases from where the zigzag line is. So I'm going to go over the zigzag line in a bit more detail. You can see that it has two sets of lines and the middle is white for that highlight. So I'm just going to draw that in now. Trying to keep it quite even in the centre. This is why we drew the two lines in earlier. So that we had a guide of where the zigzag went. Like so. So now that we've done that, I'm going to make the edges of the cupcake case more defined. And just start to shade in some of these lines we drew earlier. Thinking about the width, looking back at the image. About bringing the shading all the way down to the end of the cupcake, keeping a constant pressure on the pencil. Now I'm going to add the darker sections into these sections here. I'm going to put more pressure on my pencil, bringing it down like that. Change into the other side. Add in some of these darker lines in. And then the sketchy lines we did for this bottom section here. We're just going to go over that and make a shadow at the bottom of the cupcake. So now I've done that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back, I'm going to look at my cupcake, I'm going to look at the image, and I'm going to see what details I've missed and where I can make sections lighter or darker. Either using my pencil and putting more pressure on for the dark sections, or using a rubber if necessary to rub some of the pencil out that we've put on to create those highlights a bit more. So I'm just going to work back into mine, making sure that I've got a range of tone in here. So making some sections darker and some sections lighter if necessary. Which I'm going to do by using my rubber. I'm also going to make this section more defined because this line's a lot darker, and keeping this gap here for where the line disappears. Using my shadows to build that up. So what I'm going to do is concentrate on making this bottom section here darker. You can see on your image that the shadow is quite dark, so I'm putting a lot of pressure on my pencil, but not enough that I rip the paper. So just be mindful of that. So this is the same shade as that section there, so I'm going to make sure about that. I'm also going to put slightly more pressure into some of these areas. On the cupcake itself. Thinking about the curve. Then changing this as well, making this section here a bit darker right on the corner. Bringing that out onto the shadow. Just defining some of these corners a bit more. I'll add a bit of shading in between the zigzags. If you think you've finished, what I want you to do is look back at your image and just double check that you've not missed any details.